But let me begin today and introduce the lecture series, Julia Watkin Memorial Kierkegaard Lecture. This lecture series was inaugurated in 2006 in memory of Dr. Julia Watkin. Julia Watkin was a leading scholar in the field of Kierkegaard studies, beginning in the 1970s and 80s. She could be found at the center of the Kierkegaard world. Residing in Kierkegaard's hometown, she taught at the People's University in Copenhagen, and then later at the University of Tasmania. She was the founding editor of the long-standing International Kierkegaard newsletter. And she did invaluable work assisting Howard and Edna Hong with translations of Kierkegaard. Julia had strong ties with the Kierkegaard Library, and it's a great privilege to honor her legacy with this lecture series. Before introducing our guest, let me set the scene for how we'll proceed today. Our speaker will hold the floor for about 30 minutes, followed by discussion. So please make notes during Claudia's talk of any questions and remarks you have so we can have great discussion afterwards. Today we have an hour and 15 minutes together, and we'll end promptly at 1:45, as I know many of you have obligations afterwards. To introduce our speaker, Claudia Welz is Professor of Ethics and Philosophy of Religion at the School of Culture and Society at Aarhus University in Denmark. Claudia's research interests are wide. She has worked in ethics and philosophy of religion, continental philosophy, Jewish studies, environmental ethics, theories of subjectivity, and more, and of course, Kierkegaard studies. Since 2021, she is co-founder and co-director of the research unit for Kierkegaard studies at Aarhus University. Claudia's scholarship and teaching on Kierkegaard has played an important role in shaping Kierkegaard studies. It's a great honor to welcome Claudia in this forum today. Her lecture is titled, "Where's the Archimedean Point? Kierkegaard on Existential Orientation in Life Crises." Welcome, Claudia.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you for the wonderful invitation. I'm so happy to be here with you today. And I'll share my screen with you in a minute. Hope this is working. Yes, here is an overview of what I've planned to do today. The basic question is existential orientation. How does this work? How can we navigate in what is happening in us, to us, around us, so we can figure out what to do and what not to do? The preliminary definition of orientation is that it's a movement from confusion to clarity, both in terms of cognition and action. Yet how precisely can we achieve clarity in enormously complex situations of local and global crisis? And not to forget the personal life crisis. The word orientation is derived from the Orient, where the sun rises, when we are speaking of geographical orientation. Figuratively speaking, conscience can be termed as our ethical compass, our inner navigation system. And Immanuel Kant has written this important text, Was heißt sich im Denken orientieren? What does it mean to orient oneself in thinking? And his main point is, it means Selbstdenken, the ability to think for oneself, to uncover and avoid logical contradictions. And he also pointed to a feeling of a difference in my own subject, namely the difference between the right and the left hand. And that helps us to establish our own standpoints, according to Kant. Now, orientation goes not only through reason as Kant would like it, but also through emotions. And these are emotions in the plural, crucial within a relational network of diverse ties between people, are also corresponding emotions, all kinds of emotions. Our life together is largely determined by how we position or sit with our feelings and our thoughts, with and without words. And here, an existential hermeneutics becomes relevant when we need to decode ambiguous phenomena, for instance, face expressions that are only available in a duality of activity and passivity, of impression and expression. Werner Stegmaier, Professor Emeritus at the Universität Greifswald in Germany, he describes different forms of orientation. In his opus magnum Philosophie der Orientierung, the philosophy of orientation, it's some bit more than 800 pages. And he gives us examples of orientation, like gaining overview, using routines, using signs, etc. He defines orientation as, quote, the achievement of finding one's way in a situation under uncertainty and time pressure in order to make out opportunities for action to master the situation, end of quote. Now, I would like to add that orientation at its best also clarifies the limits of what we can master, since we can only orient ourselves realistically if we are aware of our own limits. There's always something that eludes us, that is not at our disposal, something we cannot make up for once it is lost. Health, for instance, or additional lifetime in the view of imminent death. And in this process, paradoxes can arise, where two opposing courses of action appear to be equally right, making it impossible to decide between them. And these paradoxes can make one's thinking oscillate back and forth between these two options and then block the process of thinking. And my question then is, how can such thought blockages, blockades be fertilized as thought media? Stegmaier follows Niklas Luhmann, sociologist, who suggests turning paradoxical statements into new means for thinking by keeping both alternatives open. Paradoxes which unite opposites can fill us with wonder and thereby initiate a fresh start of thinking. And for this reason, the strategy of handling paradoxes is most fruitful when the paradoxes are not dissolved, but each pole of them is respected as the keeper of a particular veri, a share of truth. And in this way, we can, as it were, operationalize complications without recoiling into oversimplifications. Now, the paradox of religious orientation in relation to God concerns the thought of something that exceeds all thinking, the notion of God or the unconditioned, which affects the very conditions of orientation. As Stegmaier has put it, everything is to be grasped via God, but he himself is ungraspable. God hides, as it were, for example, in the signs of Holy Scripture, and invites acts of decoding. However, despite all efforts of interpretation, the mystery remains and provokes personal encounters with God that may confirm or unsettle traditional accounts of the human-God relationship. So religious orientation runs the risk of holding on to something holdless. One more paradox. Although religion cannot be reduced to ethics, in religious contexts, we also have to deal with ethical questions because we can only approach the sacred or divine, which remains unmanageable and uncontrollable in German, unverfügbar, through what we can manage and control, namely what we ourselves do or prevent. What is special about religious orientation compared to purely philosophically determined orientation is that it happens coram Deo, as Luther would have put it, before God and also with God's help. Human self-understanding as being created by God and therefore not being self-dependent or self-sufficient is one of the points that Kierkegaard makes in the opening passage of The Sickness unto Death. Here he describes a human being that is dependent on its creator and also involves vulnerability, and that is the reason why all of us can suffer life crises. According to Kierkegaard's pseudonym Johannes Climacus, in chapter 3 of Philosophical Fragments, the highest paradox of thinking is to want to discover something it cannot think itself. David Law commented, if there were any affinity or point of contact between thought and the unknown, then thought would be able to think the unknown, which would mean that the unknown can be known and is therefore not the unknown. Our attempt to think the absolute thus contains a paradox that contradicts our understanding. This does not only mean that our understanding is limited. In trying to understand the paradox, our understanding also becomes paradoxical itself. As Arne Gron has put it, we must understand that we do not understand. The paradox of thinking is a critical figure by which we think the limits of thinking, not as in Kant in terms of the self-limitation of thinking, but rather in terms of an experience of thinking and in thinking, which enables us to think differently. God as the absolute other is a counterpart that only comes into play in the sense that God also precedes the game. And the implication is then that the human being becomes God's addressee. Kant's account of religious orientation lacks precisely this aspect, that we can enter into a personal relationship with God, a relationship that can only be lived and seen from the first and second person perspective. In pure reason, Kant discovers a reasonable concept of God that is a priori, that comes before the empirical and applies as the criterion for all forms of experience. Kierkegaard, by contrast, links the concept of God to a situation in which speaking to God is possible. There's a focus on the pragmatics rather than the semantics of language. And I think it's no coincidence that Kierkegaard's Christian ethics in Words of Love begins with a prayer addressed to the triune God of love. But does this mean that God acts in place of the human being as Kant suspected? Absolutely not. God cannot replace our duty to do what we are supposed to do. And for Kierkegaard, prayer influences both the motivation and the modality of our actions. And this raises the question of whether we have fulfilled the commandment to love God and our neighbors as ourselves. Consequently, prayer as the key to our paradoxical understanding with God has not only a heuristic function, but also action-related significance. And this practice of prayer presupposes the notion of a God who can hear us, who can speak to us and answer our prayers. But can we refer to God's presence as a reference point for religious orientation then? The fact that we cannot hear God's voice acoustically in the same way as a human voice suggests that God cannot be a dialogue partner at eye level. And if we cannot perceive God's voice in the same way as other sounds in the world, how can we know God's word and will? My doctor father, Ingolf Dalford, has developed philosophy of religion as a philosophy of orientation that designates God's omnipresence as a reference point for human orientation. He speaks of a Bezugspunkt. And one example would be to turn to God in an emergency case with a cry from the death, De profundis, as Psalm 130 says. And here there's at least the possibility that God can become present, if not omnipresent, if he's not always there. So that's the last resort, the cry for help to the highest authority in the universe, We could also quote Psalm 50, and call on me in the day of trouble. I will deliver you and you will honor me. You can see the sculpture by the Swedish artist Carl Milles that pictures such a cry de profundis. Now, Kierkegaard's credo is that everything is possible for God. And God is actually termed die mulies Wirklichkeit, the actuality of the possible. And in one of his journal entries, there's a prayer. It's from the same year as Works of Love, 1847. And the prayer goes like this. Grant then, O God, that we may do our best to combat the absence of spirit that wants to delude us into thinking that you are absent, in order that we may keep in mind that you are always present. So God's omnipresence is presupposed also by Kierkegaard. In The Sickness Unto Death, divine presence is described as a kind of well of possibilities. Here's a quote from the section 1cb about the necessities despair, which is to lack possibility. Quote, the believer has the ever infallible antidote for despair, possibility. Because for God, everything is possible at every moment. By contrast, the determinist or fatalist is in despair and, according to Kierkegaard, is unable to pray, because to pray is also to breathe, and possibility is for the self what oxygen is for breathing. That God's will is the possible makes me able to pray, he writes. I think this shows us that lament and petitionary prayer, these are legitimate speech acts as signs of trustful faith in God's possibilities. So Kierkegaard's point of departure is God's love for us and God's omnipresence. And in Works of Love, God is described as the God of love from whom all love in heaven and on earth flows. Human love is then to be practiced in light of and inspired by this divine love. And now I come to what everyone has waited for, Kierkegaard's testimony of an Archimedean point. This testimony can also be found in Works of Love. Christianity can show us, he writes, a point outside the world by which each of us will move heaven and earth so quietly, so lightly that no one notices it. How does the operation work? The metaphor alludes to Archimedes of Syracuse in Sicily, who lived about 200 years before Christ, and claimed that with any given force, it was possible to move any given weight. And he would move the world if he had a stable point to stand on in another world. Now, how is this point defined where, according to Kierkegaard, infinity's change can happen? I have two interpretations here. Interpretation number one, God in heaven is the Archimedean point, as God can be addressed in prayer and be present in human beings. And then everything is changed in inwardness, Kierkegaard writes, because then there is equality of all persons before God, and God has first priority. That is, the person's heart is bound to God in a bond that is never broken and can never break because of divine eternity. This invisible change of inwardness is, I think, a hermeneutical and not ontological claim. Kierkegaard also writes, there is only one kind of love, kun en art af kærlighed. And here he mentions erotic love and friendship and unselfish love of neighbor. Depending on one's perspective and horizon of interpretation, the phenomenon of love looks differently. And this change of inwardness then is a change of one's own mode of seeing everything one sees and that one tries to understand. Kierkegaard also tells us the effect of this invisible change, and he does so in terms of ethics and in terms of religion. Interhuman relations are turned into relations of unselfish neighborly love. Loving the neighbor in the beloved, that is our human task. And one of Kierkegaard's examples here is marriage, where the minister of the church asks each one individually, have you consulted with God and with your conscience? So the task is to even see the neighbor in the beloved, the preferred beloved. Then in terms of religion or verticality, he writes that the individual trusts in God despite the lack of empirical evidence. Here is a quote. If Christ had felt any need to get visible evidence, he certainly would have delivered a blow, summoned the 12 legions of angels. The worldly always needs decisions in the external sphere, otherwise it mistrustfully does not think there is a decision. But this occasion for mistrust is the spiritual trial in which faith is to be tested. End of quote. And then Kierkegaard would also refer to what should we do if we wanted to have visible evidence? Should we hang a picture of God as a proof of God's existence? And he ridicules this and says, well, this would be idolatry. But we have a problem now. The metaphor of the Archimedean point for God only fits if God is seen as a person-like addressee of human prayer. But obviously, not only in the Bible, also in Kierkegaard, we have many other metaphors. For instance, the origin of life, the well of life, non-personal metaphors. And another question is, how can the idea of one Archimedean point identified with a personal God be reconciled with the idea of God's omnipresence? Not only somewhere outside the world, as it were, but also down here in this world, in our midst, where we most need God's presence. And now here's my interpretation number 2. Conscience is the Archimedean point. And to show you that Kierkegaard himself has suggested this, here's a quote from one of his diaries. And the quote is also from the year 1847. A poor woman who weeds the gardens of the rich can say, I'm doing this for $1 a day, but that I do it very carefully is for the sake of conscience. In truth, these are kingly words. But a person must remember that he must have such words for himself with God. This is real magnificence, writes Kierkegaard. For this reason, it is very fatuous to want to make the poorer class impatient with our condition, but this phrase and this thought for the sake of conscience is a transformation of language, is the Archimedean point outside the world. And with this, when it is in deep inward silence before God, the widow woman can say that she moves heaven and earth. End of quote. The context in works of love, where you have the aforementioned quote, it's the first series of discourses, namely deliberation number 3b, called Love is a Matter of Conscience. What does that mean? Christianity has never wanted to conquer in a worldly way, Kierkegaard asserts, but has overcome the world by breathing the eternal life, the divine, into the human race, and has done so by turning every relationship between human persons into a relationship of conscience, which is a relationship of love, he states. And again, we have the same formulation of an invisible change occurring, even more miraculous than turning water into wine. And this change means quietly making everyone a king in the divine sense. So Kierkegaard imagines Christianity saying to each of us, do not busy yourself with changing the shape of the world or your situation as if you, oh, I left this out, instead of being a poor charwoman, perhaps could manage to be called Madame. And this thought of not wanting to change the external conditions has, of course, been criticized. And here you have the criticism in Jamie Ferrera's words, in her commentary on Kierkegaard's works of love. First, the attention to inner being leads to indifference to the special relations we have with a beloved, with a friend, with a child, which seem externally conditioned. And it also seems to lead to indifference to material conditions of poverty, of oppression, or other kinds of suffering in the world. So no socio-economic improvement can be expected. Such goes the criticism. But is this criticism fair? I think no, provided that inwardness is regarded as a modality of being in the world. And that's what I think Kierkegaard wants to suggest. Inwardness is not a separate realm apart from the world, but a mode of living in the world. And in Jamie Ferrera's commentary, we find a similar thought. She describes the single individual as the summoned individual who is responsible. And conscience implies questions of accountability with practical implications. How do I perform my work? No matter whether I'm cleaning for someone or whether I'm writing a book. And this inwardness, that's Jamie's point, this inwardness must turn outward. We must not withdraw from life. And the accusation that in Kierkegaard we find a cosmic otherworldliness, this would be immoral escapism, also according to Kierkegaard. And we can see this when looking at Christ's example of the Samaritan, who is showing himself to be the other man's neighbor by his mercy. And you have a painting of this scene on the book, Love's Grateful Striving. If we take this seriously, then inwardness is not a secret chamber within me, but my mode of relating to the world outside of me. Now, there's another term that Kierkegaard introduces in connection with this deliberation on conscience. It's the middle term of interhuman relations mediated by love as a matter of conscience. And here he says it's God. Quote, love is qualified as a matter of conscience only when either God or the neighbor is the middle term. What is changed when God or the neighbor is seen as Mellanbestimmelse in a love relation? God is not what keeps the lovers away from each other, but rather that which binds them to each other. For God himself is the love through or in which human beings love each other, whether they know it or not. That God is in our midst means further that each of us belongs first and foremost to God, and that we are equal before God, and that we are first and foremost each other's neighbor. Now, when love becomes a matter of conscience, the lover, the human being, as a neighbor to his or her fellow human beings, has has God to deal with in everything, also in interhuman relations. And when the neighbor is seen as the middle term of a love relation, this guarantees that the love is not selfish, since then I cannot identify with a neighbor to the degree that I see him or her as my alter ego, as another self, while withdrawing from others. What is between two persons is not only the medium through which they meet each other, but becomes also the middle term that orients their relation. The middle term is irreducible to the two. It is, as it were, the third, but not an entity, not a third person, but rather a hermeneutical category, and the point of reference to which they are referred when they wish to understand themselves in their relation. And this third does not simply coincide with the relation, because it also serves as the criterion of the relation. And according to Kierkegaard, love is rightly termed a matter of conscience if the relatedness to God serves as criterion of the interhuman relation. And thus the secret of love between two is the third that surpasses their relation from within. The Latin word conscientia designates a knowing with oneself, testifying to one's thoughts and feelings, as well as to one's actions and decisions in relations to others. Kierkegaard would continue in Works of Love and say, to relate to God is precisely to have conscience. But we cannot take for granted that it is God speaking through conscience. Yet in order to find out whether this is the case, we need to be attentive to what conscience says. And I've earlier described conscience as an interface of aesthetic, ethical, and religious aspects of Kierkegaard's existential approach. In general, in his writings, conscience appears both as an inner witness, as a power of judgment, and as the experience of a call that conveys an ethical demand. Let's have a little side glance to Martin Buber, who writes in The Way of the Human Being, Der Weg des Menschen, quote, the Archimedean point from which I at my place can move the world is the transformation of myself. That seems to align pretty well with Kierkegaard's point when he refers to conscience. And let me come to the conclusion. How to bear the weight, for instance, of grief and sorrow, of existential problems and pain. Where is this Archimedean point that Kierkegaard refers us to? The Archimedean point from which we move heaven and earth. He would emphasize, we don't do this by changing the circumstances, but rather by helping us to become able to bear whatever we have to bear in our lives. Ethical religious orientation, according to Søren Kierkegaard, means finding the Archimedean point. We could also call it the fixed star. And it's absolutely crucial in our orientation or reorientation to focus on something that is stable. Marcus Vried argues that God's revelations are like trigonometric points in our everyday life that help us to take measure anew. And he does so in a text on prayer, Gebet und Theologie. And prayer is described as a speech act that centers our consciousness on God, who is expected to give us a kind of guidance in difficult decisions, a new foothold when the ground rocks beneath us. Again, a trigonometric function. How can we translate this mathematical metaphor into ethical religious orientation? Well, it's very simple. If you only have the point C that you can see in the scheme, then you can calculate the points A and B. So let's take C to be God's unchanging love as the light in the darkness, the fixed star, or the Archimedean point. And A could then be the question to ourselves, what should I do? And B, the question, what is a meaningful life for me in terms of how it is lived? Kierkegaard's emphasis on the hvorledes in Danish. And he would direct us to Christ. Typically, Bertel Thorvaldsen's Christ figure was inaugurated in 1829 in the church where Kierkegaard often would be present and even preach, Vor Frue Kirke in Copenhagen. And there, on the socket, there's a quote from the Gospel of Matthew. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." God and human being are, as it were, opposite to each other, or before each other, over against each other, in an encounter that forms us by forcing us to relate also to what happens in our life with other human persons. And according to Kierkegaard, everything that happens must be received as a gift from God's hand, even though it is rather a burden to be born. And it's telling that his favorite Bible verse is from James 1:17. "Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows." Is it only good that comes down from heaven? When thinking of, for instance, the war in the Ukraine or in Gaza, it's not only something good that comes down from heaven, it's also missiles, it's bombs. What would Kierkegaard have said there? I guess he would have focused not on the status quo, but on how the situation can be changed. Everything can become good or better, even if things are going really badly to begin with, because God can turn a life crisis around, or even a global crisis, so that we can grow from it and thrive again. Kierkegaard's theology can give us hope and courage to look forward, even in situations where human possibilities seem to be exhausted. But again, where can we get what we cannot provide ourselves? Kierkegaard suggests that existential orientation in life crisis takes place in an awareness that God's spirit of love is present. This does not make it any easier to understand why God lets things happen that we would rather not have liked to experience. But before God, we can also come to understand that we understand far too little to be able to judge God. And instead, we need to work with ourselves and our own thoughts and feelings and allow God to transform them. And that can happen precisely in prayer. That's why a dialogue is needed, particularly with God in prayer. To learn to receive everything from God's hands, this is a topic that Kierkegaard also discussed in one of his upbuilding discourses, or no, it's actually not called upbuilding, but it's a godly, a divine speech on the lily and the bird. And we are to learn what is divinely required of man from the lily and the bird, namely silence, obedience, and joy. And when we listen in silence, obedience, and joy, the unknown future is met with trust and hope. So we are required to become silent in order to listen to God instead of constantly talking and complaining. We are to accept God's will instead of wanting to decide everything for ourselves, and to find joy in the midst of sorrow, as difficult as this may be. And yes, it is a paradoxical movement. It is a counter move to self-defeating despair or hopelessness, where we give up before even having begun. There's a control question that we can ask ourselves. Do I act in correspondence with the person that I want to be and become? And in this line, Hannah Arendt quotes Plato's Gorgias, where evil-doing appears as disharmony with oneself and as self-contradiction, as being out of tune with myself. And it's conscience, also in her text, in her posthumously published Responsibility and Judgment, conscience revealing the perpetrator. I know the agent and am condemned to live together with him. And to avoid that, better don't do what you're about to do. And now we can ask, what about self-deception? What about propaganda war? What about ideology? Well, we also need a dialogue with others to test our own points of view. In my inaugural lecture at Aarhus University, I've described theological epistemology as a discipline of dialogical life orientation, which involves both dialogues with other human beings, that's the ethical part of it, but also a dialogue with God, and that's the theological part of it. While dialogue with other human beings is, without doubt, it's necessary, it is not sufficient, as it lacks the divine meta perspective that not only stands above all others, but is also in their midst to connect different views and incorporate others' perspectives. And that's what I find really exciting about Kierkegaard's Archimedean point when we connect this to perspectivity. In one of his edifying discourses, he writes that alvoren at ville høre efter til at ville gøre derefter. So hearing must be translated into action. And that's seriousness. Only if that happens, then we are serious. Control question number 2. How is a specific action being done? Is it done with love and kindness? Is there respect for others? Are they allowed to think freely? Are they allowed to say what they want? Or are they expected to just do what is determined by those who shout loudest? Existential hermeneutics implies that we need to think about ourselves as well when we think about something else and about the tensions in human existence. Matthew Beggar, in his book The Uses of Paradox, argues that even the absurd ultimately serves human self-transformation. The cognitive dissonance becomes modesty, and the union with God ends with self-transcendence, human self-transcendence. And according to Beggar, Kierkegaard refuses to reconcile opposites because he understands Christianity not as a doctrine, but rather as an indirect communication that requires subjective appropriation in order to change the human being from within. And there's also a difference between upbuilding discourses that rest in mood, move and edify, presuppose that people already know what love is and seek to win them to it, and the deliberations. That's a subtitle of works of love. Works of love are deliberations, all violence. And he characterizes these deliberations as being impatient. A deliberation awakens, provokes, and sharpens thought, sometimes with irony. One must first fetch people up out of the cellar, call to them, turn their comfortable way of thinking topsy-turvy with the dialectics of truth, he writes in a journal entry. And now let me come to the close. The most important Kierkegaardian virtue of orientation is patience. Patience in faith, love, and hope. He writes in his discourse To Preserve One's Soul in Patience that patience herself is a spiritual counselor who knows all suffering and comforts us by enduring with us, or rather in us. Because what we need most of all is to preserve ourselves in whatever life crisis we are in. Preserving ourselves by preserving faith, hope, and love within us. Thank you so much for your attention and not least for your patience. Looking forward to our conversation and to learning something new from you.